Carolyn, I wonder if I could suggest to you and to Martin, if people could just say hello on the chat button on the right, so everyone just says hi, where you're from, then we don't have to waste a lot of time with introductions.
Lovely, thank you, Peter.
Peter, they're going to be going into breakouts, so they're going to do their introductions in the breakouts.
Okay, but then before they do that, they can do it in the chat. Great.
Okay.
But do feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. But yes, we will introduce in the breakouts when we go in. So thank you very much all for joining us, and welcome to our Remission in Rheumatoid Arthritis Patient Perspective SIG. Is that moving on? There we go. So just to introduce you to the leadership, we have had a change of co-chairs since we last met. So we weren't at the 2018 OMERACT as a SIG, but we were there back in 2016. So Martin, who of course you all know is still our European co-chair alongside myself. I've taken over from Lilian. Susanna Proudman's taken over from Catherine Hill, and Peter Tugwell, who again you all know is our USA co-chair. We've got two new fellows, Bethan and Ricardo, and I'll briefly talk about their work, and our patient partners who have been with us since the start over the past 10 years, Marika and Vinyanda. So these are our list of working group members. They are listed on the website, so I won't dwell on that slide if you want to have a look, but thank you very much to our working group for all of their input. And just to thank you in advance now for your contributions. So thank you very much for coming today. And if you would like to join our working group, do get in touch. Excuse me. This is likely to be the final meeting of the SIG with the current co-chair structure. So you may like to think about whether you'd be interested in co-chairing this SIG or taking on an active role in shaping the future of the research agenda for this. So the format today, I'll give a brief rationale for why we looked into patient-reported remission. Martin will present the results of the validation study, which has been taking place since we last had a SIG. Then we'll move into breakout groups for 45 minutes, and we'll discuss the proposed conclusions from the work that Martin presents and some suggested future research agenda items. And then we'll go back to the main group for any final discussion points and for voting. And just a reminder, the session is being recorded, so you're aware. So as our fellows won't be able to, or aren't presenting their work as they would have been in Colorado Springs, just a brief summary on what they've been up to. Because the group's been around for such a while now, we thought it was important to revisit our literature review to make sure that the group is still current and relevant. Excuse me. So Beth Jones conducted a literature review for us to ensure that there was nothing new related to remission that made the group's work redundant. And Ricardo Ferreira, as part of his PhD studies, found that individual patient data from 11 randomized controlled trials suggests that the patient global adds little to the other 3 remission criteria in predicting radiological outcomes. He would have presented that as a poster, but we don't have the time to go into that in depth in this. So hopefully you've all watched the video before attending, so this is just a very brief summary. Back at OMERACT in 2010, it was suggested that the draft ACR-EULAR remission criteria might have patient important information missing because patients had never been asked what they thought in constructing that. So we conducted focus groups to understand what was important to people with rheumatoid arthritis, to consider their disease activity as good as gone or in remission. And through that work, we identified 26 themes or domains. We took those domains forward to a survey study across 6 countries, and patients prioritised pain, fatigue, and independence as the key missing domains. And I'm now going to hand over to Martin to cover the next phase of that validation study. So it may be helpful for you to keep in mind while Martin's presenting that the questions we'll be asking in relation to his data are, do you agree that decisions on the current criteria need to be taken now? And do you agree that there is insufficient evidence from the data to change the ACR-EULAR remission criteria at this time? over to Martin. And I'll stop sharing.
Thank you, Carolyn. Let's see if it works. I practiced. Can you all see my screen coming up? Just wave, yeah, okay. So I have a lot of slides to present because this was quite a substantial analysis, so I'll get right in there. The first phases and the second phases Caroline has summarized. So what I'm going to talk about is the phase 3, which is looking for instruments to measure pain, fatigue, and independence, and then explore their added value to the remission criteria. And at the OMERACT 2016 SIG, we had presentation of interim results, the task, we were tasked to focus on adding or replacing instruments in the current ACR-EULAR remission definition. The study purpose of the study I'm going to present is to, in the setting of patients who have low disease activity or remission, to validate patient-reported outcome instruments to measure the domains pain, fatigue, and independence, and then to explore whether these domains add information to the current definition of remission in rheumatoid arthritis, either on top or instead of the patient global assessment, which is the only patient-reported outcome currently in the remission criteria. What we did is we formed an international cohort of RA patients in 4 cities that entered with either low disease activity, defined as a DAS smaller than 3.2, or patient perceived remission, which was defined for this study as patients who answered yes to the question, would you say that at this moment your disease activity is as good as gone? And they had to answer yes, obviously. And the phrasing was taken from the previous survey study, and we measured a lot of things in routine practice at baseline 3 and 6 months. What we did, we measured, of course, at each time point whether they still answered yes to that question, and then we studied the domains of pain, fatigue, and independence in multiple ways, for pain with a numerical rating scale from the RAID, EQ5D pain and EQ5D discomfort. For fatigue, we had 3 instruments, and for independence, we made a new numerical rating scale based on patient input with this question: over the last week, have you been able to do things as and when you want without needing any kind of assistance? We also measured the HAC, the SF36, the other EQ5D domains, and the other RAID domains. Then we measured the remaining domains of the WHO-EULAR core set for RA. We checked whether patients were in Boolean remission, what their DAS was, what their SDI was, and we wanted to do radiographs, but that failed, and obviously had some baseline information. The analysis we did were both cross-sectional and longitudinal. Cross-sectional to see whether the instruments we had chosen for the 3 domains correlated with other disease activity measures, and whether they could discriminate between remission, yes or no, at baseline. And the longitudinal analysis were focused on detection of change in the remission state or in the DAS 28 low disease activity state, defined as 2.6. And I'm going to come back to that. We used the periods of 0 to 3 and 3 to 6 to log those changes. So a single patient could contribute twice to the analysis. Then the next step, we looked whether the baseline value of a specific instrument was able to predict HAC remission at 6 months. And then finally, we tried to select the best instruments and assess their added value to the current remission criteria. So that's a whole lot of work. And it's Linda Ras who did all the work, and she should have been presenting here, but unfortunately she and her father were struck by COVID. They're recovering, but they're not able to present anything of this kind at this time. She sends her greetings to all of you. So what did we have? We had a population of a total of 246 patients, but unfortunately, most of the longitudinal patients were from 2 centers, Amsterdam and Adelaide, and the other centers only supplied patients with baseline data. At baseline, all the centers contributed with patients with a quite long disease duration of about 10, that those patients were participating in an early RA trial. So that's a big difference. And so these patients, of course, were not on biologicals, where varying proportions of the other centers, patients were using biologicals, and the spread of the other stuff is, well, as to be expected, except for perhaps for, if you look at the HAC, for patients with such long disease duration, the HAC was very low, sorry about that, but that may be due to the selection of patients who were in very low disease activity. Cross-sectional results at baseline, the instruments, all the instruments that we looked at had a moderate correlation with the disease activity at baseline, and the discrimination between remission, yes or no, both for patient-perceived remission and Boolean remission, was excellent for all the instruments. I'm not going to show you the numerical results of that. And then if we looked at the longitudinal changes in slightly more detail, we looked whether patients in a period, say, between baseline and 3 months were in declared self-perceived remission at both time points. Then we would say this is a stable patient in remission. If they were in remission at baseline but not at 3 months, so they were worsening, they were changing from yes to no, and likewise in the other direction from no to yes. We repeated the assessments for the period of 3 to 6 months to fill our data set, and we repeated the analysis and used as a cut point DAS smaller than 2.6 instead of self-perceived remission. For validity, we would expect in a stable group that the instrument we test in 3 months, the change should be close to 0 and highly non-significant in terms of statistics. And for the change groups, we would want the measure to change in the proper direction, and the statistical test should be significant. So here's the first result table of the longitudinal analysis. In the stable patients, we expect to see no changes, and by and large, there are no changes except for dimension of the BRAF fatigue scale, where there is a significant difference, but it's a large sample size, and the changes are very small. So those instruments work, and likewise for the other instruments we tested, by and large, most instruments are showing no change when there shouldn't be change. Then if we look at the longitudinal changes, we immediately see the problems appearing, because in the 2 columns to the right, changing from yes to no and no to yes, you can see that the sample sizes are quite small. And that's because we only have the Amsterdam and Adelaide patients contributing, and the groups are not full anymore because we partialized them into changes. Then you see that there are small to moderately large significant changes in the proper direction for both pain and fatigue numerical rating scales, with a variable performance of the other instruments. And then this is a very busy table. If we look at the domain independence and we look at the HAC and the elements of the SF36 and EQ5D, you can see that sample sizes dropping to very, very low numbers. So I think the analysis of these results is quite difficult. And for the instrument that we specifically designed to measure independence, the independence NRS, which is in this row over here, you can see there were only 12 patients in each of the change groups. So it's very hard to get a good conclusion from that. We can say that the two dimensions of the rate that we selected were very discriminative, but they're not really measuring independence, they're measuring something close by. Okay, let me go to the next slide here. So far, cross-sectional, for almost all instruments, we have correlation the way we want it, and discrimination, and longitudinally, pain and fatigue work well, and independence NRS works well in stable situation, but functional disability NRS works best in change, and there's a low sample size for the other instruments. Then if we go to whether the baseline value of these instruments is able to predict HAC remission, and the simple answer is all instruments perform well. So now we have to go to the selection of best instruments, and we can say, well, numerical rating scales for pain and fatigue are fine, and for independence we cannot really make a single choice because our NRS is probably closest to the construct but doesn't perform very well with low sample sizes. So for independence, we did our analysis with multiple instruments. This is also very difficult. I'm sorry, can't help it, but it's the way it is. What do we do?
We are not seeing.
Yeah?
Martin,
Yeah.
I think your screen has dropped out.
Oh.
We just lost the last slide.
Oh, okay. Share screen. Yeah, I see it. Let's see whether it starts working again. So can you see it now?
Yes.
Okay. And did everybody see this slide before it dropped out?
No.
Anybody? No?
No.
How about this one?
Yeah,
Go back to slide one.
No, that one.
only
You
the
didn't
last
see
one.
this one either?
Yeah, we saw that one.
Oh, okay. So this is what I said, but then you didn't see the slide. So we can use the pain NRS and NRS, that can work. And for independence, we take the NRS, but we take along some other instruments as well, because we're not fully satisfied that the independence NRS is the best instrument. Okay, so going forward now to how to analyze whether there is added value of putting these instruments in a sort of a new remission definition. What we do, we only have the HAC remission we can predict, and we say, okay, let's look at the elements of the remission definition right here, put them into a stepwise backward logistic regression, and then add these other instruments in and see what happens. The second analysis is the same, but then add in patient perceived remission, just the yes/no question. And then repeat the analysis for the Boolean yes/no, so that's everything together, and repeat for these two variations. And then for the second step, we put in something else than the independence NRS, the other instruments we have. So it's a lot of reanalysis of stuff. And then the third step is to do a forward logistic regression and to say, okay, what do we start with Boolean and then add instruments and determine the increase of explained variance. Then take out the patient global from the Boolean definition and add in one or more instruments and see what happens. And again, we did that with several independence instruments. So what are the results of all of this? In the stepwise backward logistic regression to predict HAC remission, the independence NRS worked better than any of these other instruments. So the independence NRS kicked everything out, including the current remission instruments. If we did the analysis with patient perceived remission, the results, the HAC remission was best predicted by tender joint count and patient global assessment. If we repeat the analysis for the Boolean remission as a whole and try to add these instruments in, or subtract them actually, again, the independence NRS stays as the only measure that is predicting HAC remission. And if we repeat the analysis with patient perceived remission instead of these added instruments, then Boolean and patient perceived remission stay in the equation. So this is a summary of the results. And then finally, if we do the sensitivity analysis with the other instruments for independence, the performance is not as good as the independence NRS. So that brings us to quite confusing conclusion. It's not really straightforward. And if we go to the fixed forward logistic regression, we get this table, which is trying to see, okay, what is added to the Boolean complete remission definition if we add in one or more of these instruments. And what you should look at in tables like this is to see whether the R squares, which are the results in the two last columns, whether they increase substantially from the top row. And the calculations is slightly different, but if you focus, for example, on the third column, you can see the Boolean has an R square of 0.23. And then if you add in pain, it goes up a little bit. And if you add in all the instruments, it goes up slightly more, but it doesn't really get a lot higher. And I have to remind you, if you start adding in all these instruments into a criteria set, nobody will ever be in remission. So that's not really a good idea. So there's limited value to adding one or more of the patient-defined domains to the current remission definition in terms of predicting HAC remission, which is the only thing we have. And then we did another analysis where we tried to replace the patient global with one of the other measures, and pain, fatigue, or independence, or any combination of these is not really better than the patient global. So to conclude, patients have indicated pain, fatigue, and independence as most important domains to determine whether their disease activity is as good as gone. And in the setting of low disease activity or remission, you can measure pain and fatigue with a numerical rating scale, and they're valid in different scenarios. And for independence, the choice is not completely clear. Pain and fatigue we already have in the core set, and independence is an important new domain with the NRS needing for further study. Based on the current study, we feel there is no convincing argument to replace the patient global assessment in the Boolean definition or add one or more alternative domains, with a caveat that the limitations are we have low sample size and we have no imaging for damage, which was the second criterion in the current remission core set. And I think that's the end of this presentation. I'll keep the share on just for some informative questions before we go into breakouts.
So the breakout feature isn't working, Martin.
It isn't working.
There is no breakout magic today. No, sorry.
So we stay in the big group?
Yeah, the only alternative is everyone leave and come to another meeting.
I don't think that's a good idea.
Yeah.
How many people are in the group at this time?
44.
Okay, so that will be a challenge. Well, let's just see how we go, and let's start taking questions. The only thing is, I think maybe Caroline, you should be chairing that, and we should have a system for raising hands or something, or people doing something in the chat. In that case, I have to stop the share to...
sorry, Martin, don't stop the share. I'm just wondering, could you go back to the couple of slides? Is it slide 31 and 32, where you come to draw the conclusions that it didn't add anything? And
this is the last part. This is one of the analysis. This is the last analysis.
Right. Okay. Okay. So I would think so. And our square going from 31 to 43%. I don't know. Like, how do you? At what point is it a statistical decision, or is it a? At what point do you say that that's not adding anything?
Well, no, it is. Of course, it's adding anything, but
Yeah.
but you're
Is it enough? Yeah.
you're saturating your regression analysis. So in the end, you have an R square that's really really cool, but there's you've taken away all the variability.
Okay, but it's also really cool because we've added in what the patients wanted. So it's sort of, I think it's a dangerous conclusion to say that the things that really matter to patients, we're almost saying the things that matter to patients don't matter.
No.
I know. I'm just saying, that could be an external perspective of what a conclusion that we've come to here. But even statistically, it does matter. It is helping. Yeah. But just maybe you're thinking not enough.
I think you have to be really careful with this, because the problem with adding in more criteria is that that for that 2 patients in the data set for which those criteria will apply, you can really predict their hack remission well. But for the 98% who do not apply because they're missing one of the 7 things that you could be asking people to to meet, you wouldn't have anyone in your data set anymore. So I think you need for something to be selected on the basis of this analysis. And again, this is an R square, which is explained variability in the regression analysis. So it's just a way to get a feel of what's going on. And each of these factors adds a little bit. So if you add lots of little bits, then it becomes a little bit more. But then you cannot make criteria anymore. It's not saying that these things which are important, and not only to patients, they should be important to doctors too. It's not that they're not important. It's just that they are not adding sufficient information in this analysis to say we should be adding them, because then we're going to get a better fix on what happens to these patients. That would be my...
Yeah, I agree that sample size is a bit too small to draw the conclusions, but I would argue that they do appear to be adding more. And one of the criticisms of the remission criteria is, well, they don't even include fatigue, which is been deemed a core outcome now in monitoring RA. And we've always wondered what's in the patient global. So if you move on to your next slide, where you look to see whether you could replace the patient global, you got by taking out patient global and putting in the things that the 3 there on the bottom line, pain, fatigue, and independence, you've done better than you did with the patient global, and it's more granularity, like it's actually capturing the key components of the patient global. So I think we're well on the way to showing that the remission criteria should be changed, and maybe with the sample size, we're not quite there yet, but I think we started.
Okay. This is what we really need to discuss, and I'm not going to answer anymore, because then I will be giving my opinion. I think we should be taking opinions, and I think your opinion is extremely valuable and also very detailed in terms of your interpretation of the analysis. So let's take some more opinions, no. First, are there any questions of the kind, I don't understand what you did, or this went by too fast. Please show me this table again before we move into expressions of opinion on what we've been showing.
I have a question about the way the study is set up.
you say that you're talking about adding all of these domains in and whether it predicts better, but, or rather explains better. But as I understood what you're doing is seeing how well all of these domains do in predicting hack remission. So what is it that makes a combination of these domains better than just using hack remission?
Okay, so the way the study was set up was to mirror the way the RA remission criteria were made, which was to say which combination of features and cutoffs in a set of measures is best able to predict either, no, actually both hack remission and damage remission, if you want. So the way the criteria worked was that one of the most important reasons to choose the current criteria was that they worked so well in predicting hack remission and damage remission. So those two things are, if you want, the external anchor to say, is this good or is this not good? If I were to take the hack to try and predict the hack, obviously that would work really well. But we're trying to see what measures of disease activity are best to predict a good outcome in the future. And we've defined a good outcome as having a great hack and not having damage progression. That was the original study. And in this study, unfortunately, we did not have damage data. So we had to do with the hack data alone. So that's a real limitation of the study. And that's the other limitation apart from the small sample size for some of the analysis which we did, which I think severely limits the conclusions we can draw from this. Does that make it more clear?
Yes, it does make it more clear. It still seems to me that if you're using hack remission as predicting hack remission as your standard, I just can't help but wonder if earlier hack remission is a better predictor than,
absolutely.
Well, if earlier, why not just use hack remission as
because the intent of the remission criteria is not to predict hack remission. Hack remission is just, if you want, a ruler by which we can judge the quality of the remission criteria.
I guess, okay, I'll just say this and then stop, but I don't see why if it's a good ruler, then I don't see why you just don't use that as your standard of remission. And if it's not a good ruler, then I don't see why the study tells you that explaining more of the prediction of hack remission is something of value. It's only of value if hack remission is a really good ruler. And if it is a really good ruler, I just don't see why not use hack remission.
Okay, point noted. I think we have to go on to some more questions.
Fine,
yes,
fine.
No, but it's a good point, and we should explain that really well, which is quite hard in the 15 minutes with all these numbers. So we should do a better job of that.
If you've got a question specifically relating to just clarifying the data, could you stick your hand up? Otherwise, we'll move on to just general discussion.
Caroline, because we're not in 3 groups, shall we ask the rapporteurs just to make a few notes? Although there'll be duplications, at least we'll have.
I'm taking notes.
Thank you very much.
So I know that the numbers are bigger for pain, fatigue than they are for independence, but I think just to understand the information about the patients potentially being the same or different in the way they're responding to pain and fatigue, it would be good to see the data for just the 52 patients that had pain, fatigue, and independence data.
I'm not sure that there's even 52.
I don't know. I mean, there's the 18 and 34, so I don't know if you have pain, fatigue, and independence for all of them, or
Yeah, probably yes. But you can see, yeah, so the sample size is sometimes 70 and sometimes 69, and then when independence comes in, it's all of a sudden 34. So I think it is 18 plus 34 for all the analysis where independence comes in.
I just think that your R square is going up for, I mean, if I'm understanding the data well with the independence alone. So I'm just really concerned that we're saying that independence may not be beneficial to add in versus it may be. And I tend to agree with Lynn that from a patient perspective, you can say that the patient global is capturing all of these things, but if there is further refinement in how the data are captured with pain, fatigue, and independence, it may be more acceptable to patients. I understand the comments, you know, related to they may never get rid of their pain, so then are they never going to be in remission? But that said, if it's appropriately classifying patients still, then it may still be of value.
I think there's two comments here. One is about trying to make sense of this table, and as you allude to, and I agree, if you look at the numbers underlying those R squares, which is the 2 log likelihood, they're so widely different that maybe the estimates with independence should not be in the same table as the estimates with only pain, fatigue, or the combination of those, because it's really hard to compare data that have such highly varying sample sizes. And the other point you're making, it comes back to what Lynn said, and that is, wouldn't it be great if we could get more information than just this patient global, because there's so much things in it. I would totally agree to that. So what we're discussing here is not whether we should be measuring pain, fatigue, and independence, measuring them, versus making remission criteria that explicitly include a criterion, a cut point on those measures, in addition or to replace what we have now. And I think we have to distinguish those two in the discussion.
Yeah. The third comment I would add to that, though, is that if we look at these data, especially if you look at pain and independence, fatigue and independence, pain, fatigue, and independence, the numbers are the same, but they seem to be driven by independence. So my concern, too, is that not having an equatable sample size for independence versus pain and fatigue, we're maybe underestimating the importance of capturing independence.
Well, I have to make a comment. I was hoping Ricardo would make it, but he's taking notes, so he can't. One of the big problems with independence is, of course, that it is quite highly correlated to HAQ. So independence is more likely to come up as good when you start predicting HAQ remission, which comes back to Joan's remark. Why not just use the HAQ to predict HAQ remission? HAQ would probably be best if we put HAQ in, although we did put HAQ in and the results were not that much better, which is basically saying for this analysis, probably we can do the HAQ in one question and just ask about independence. But it's a little bit circular. So our ruler, the external ruler we're using, which is HAQ remission, has its deficiency in addition to having limited information on the yes/no of the independence. And that's a big problem with this data set.
Martin, this is Jazz. I think.
Hi, Jazz.
Hi. The way first off, I think hats off to the teams who actually did the work, and the way you made this very simple, present in a way that it's easy to understand. My comment is that I think from the data you've shown, with all the limitations that this study has, like every other study done to date in science, small sample size, limited follow-up, different samples for some measures. The data, at least based on what I've seen, agree with your conclusion that at least based on these data, that there is not additional evidence to add new instruments and cut points to improve remission definition. Now, that does not mean that that could not change with another study or another sample or much larger longitudinal study or the study designed a different way. Perhaps one outcome from this, Martin, you and others might have, is how to design the next study to answer the still persisting questions in this regard that could be addressed with a better or a different study.
Well, yeah, I think that's a key question, and as Caroline alluded, at least part of the team of the special interest group has been measuring their own fatigue, and it's gotten to be pretty high. You know, we started this in 2010, and I think we did some really important work, especially in the beginning, where we teased out the most important domains of the patient perceived remission, and we developed an instrument. And I think the snags came along in designing this prospective study, where, well, I think in total it took us about 7 years to get the data in a format that we could actually do these analyses. Where at the beginning, you know, everybody was really enthusiastic, and there were a lot more centers that were going to put in data, and everybody was going to do 6 months follow-up, and everybody was going to do and read the radiographs. And well, this is what we have now. So if we design another study, probably we'll need significant funding for people to be able to complete the study, because obviously this study was done in routine practice in people's spare time, and then this is what you get realistically. So the reason we're pushing, at least for a preliminary conclusion, is to say, well, you know, this is what we have, and please someone else pick it up and go further with what we have, and try to find some money to do it quicker and more completely.
Martin, you probably don't have access to the chat as the lead there, or?
Well, yeah, currently no. Then I have to stop screen sharing. So if I can stop screen sharing, if there's no more content questions, then I can also access the chat as well.
Comments in there, yeah, great.
So let's see. Are there more content questions on this presentation? No. Okay, then I'll try to stop screen sharing. Let me see.
Well, Martin's just stopping sharing his screen, just to let you know that there is a discussion board up for remission, and it will be open for 2 weeks after today. So if you don't feel that your points have been fully discussed, then you will be able to continue the discussion offline afterwards. I noticed there are a lot of points in the chat to cover, and there's probably more questions going to come now. My Zoom keeps crashing, so that's why I keep briefly disappearing. So if I do drop out, then if someone else could jump in. It also means I haven't got access to all of the questions that came in before I last dropped out. But did anybody want to ask a question out loud that they've put in chat? Or I can read some out.
I think it'd be good to just read them out, or pull out the important points that we haven't discussed.
I think I've crashed again. So
okay, so I'm looking at a couple of questions, for example, from Peter and Grayson about, you know, what if you have something that will make that you can never go into remission? For instance, if you have a fixed disability, then you would not be independent anymore, or you could perhaps not be independent anymore. So then you could never be in remission. Yes, that is true, and that is also things that are being raised of even the current remission criteria, where, say, if you have a fixed disability in 2 joints that hurt all the time, and there's no more synovitis in there, you still have 2 joints. You can't be in remission anymore. And then I think another thing which we haven't really stressed tonight, but which is very important. These remission criteria are intended for research. They are only intended in a way to create a group in trials, to say, okay, here's a group of people who met these criteria at the end of the intervention, and there were more of those people in the intervention group than, say, the placebo group. So it's telling us something about people who are doing really well by very strict criteria. And a lot of the discussion on the criteria has been introduced by, actually the committee saying in the discussion, well, maybe you can also use them in practice. Yes, you can use them in practice, but then the significance of being in remission changes for reasons such as this. So that would be my response to that question.
But patients in trials could have the same problem.
Sure, but it doesn't matter as long as you can discriminate between groups.
That doesn't make full sense. That if you take out a subset of people that can never achieve your outcome, that's problematic from a design standpoint.
I know, so it should never be the primary outcome, which some people are trying to. If you want to discriminate between patient groups, remission should be a secondary outcome that defines a subset of patients that in very strict terms, are the best you can be. We don't solve the problem. I know.
One can recognize independence as an incredibly important outcome without necessarily including it in this definition if it's going to be unusable. And so I think the two are not contrary, yet it reduces the viability of the outcome measure.
Okay, so you are arguing we should not include independence in a new remission criterion set?
I think making it strictly dichotomous and making it absolute is problematic. One could say a worsening of independence. One could say improvement. You could have a different baseline. It is much like damage versus activity, whether it be vasculitis or lupus or other features, where in fact you're looking for things that are changeable and things that are not. And when change into remission is a response to treatment. And if something is never going to respond, that's problematic from a measurement standpoint. I think the concept is incredibly important. It's actually quite interesting to think of this within the context of RA. And I think this has been very interesting work, but it's problematic.
Peter, just on that, in an early RA trial, you want independence to not change. You want it to be totally good and stay totally good for them to be, responder and in remission. So I think it's a critically important outcome. But in that situation, you don't want it to change. Yeah.
You could. I agree. If you're already there, you don't want it to go out from being there. If you have some partial lack of independence, you unfortunately could get worse. And so it's made how you fix the baseline and then you change from that is less absolute than some ephemeral definition of absolute remission. Because in real life, people are looking to themselves and not necessarily to everybody in the group.
Are we only discussing drug treatment and clinical trials that are looking at drugs? I mean, Peter, if you say that independence, there are some groups that will never achieve that. I think one side is it depends on how you define independence, but the other thing is treatment and the management of a disease. You might need other interventions to increase independence of people. And so I'm a little bit more positive that in the end we should really be aspirational, that all efforts should be on a management of a rheumatic condition to achieve independence as much as possible for each patient. But in many cases, this cannot be achieved by drugs, and we should look beyond probably only drugs. But do we also include that when we are now discussing this concept of dependence in clinical trials?
I agree. I mean, I think it's an incredibly important outcome. It's just you need to think about the practicality of how it would work within a trial, whether that be a trial of bracing or companion care or all sorts of things that could occur. But it's still the same issue. I think that you have to just the baseline. I think this is a problem in multiple diseases. This is not unique to RA. It's a happy problem we're discussing this in RA, by the way, compared to when some of us started in rheumatology. Let me tell you, this is a happy problem that we're talking about remission and all these improvements we have.
I am just picking up a very interesting suggestion from the chat where people are suggesting that if we were to change the anchor question in the patient global to specifically point out these 3 domains, so instead of saying, considering all the ways in which your arthritis affects you, adding something like considering all the ways your arthritis affects you, and especially pain, fatigue, and your independence, which would make it a very long stem, but we can work on that. How have you been the past few weeks? Then you're loading the question in the direction of the 3 most important domains, and then at least you will know that the patients being asked the questions have taken that into consideration. I think that's a beautiful suggestion.
Have we got any patients that might like to contribute their thoughts on this?
It was actually it was Grayson who started that discussion. So it was a patient who put it up there first. Yeah.
Great.
Just aware that I know we've Martin spoke, David spoken, but I'm aware that quite a lot of clinicians and researchers have had their say so far. So if any patients wanted to jump in.
So from what I'm hearing is I think that there is agreement that now do we have that on Zoom calls as well? Oh, I love it. Okay, so what I'm hearing is that there is a quite broad agreement that independence is an interesting thing to study, and we should be looking, for further instruments or refining or validating this NRS. I'm all for very simple NRSs for things rather than making incredibly difficult questionnaires, but that there is quite a lot of discussion on how and if to include such a thing in a remission definition. Would that be a fair summary of this point? Nobody's shouting. I'm going to assume that is a yes. We should not only have a raised hand, but we should have a furiously shouting button to emulate OMERACT when it gets heated. Or raise your fist, like something like that. Okay, so yes, go.
It's Pam, yeah. So it's Pam, and I have RA. And I have had RA for about 38 years. So
Pam, can you speak a little bit louder?
Sorry, yeah, I'll just put that up.
There, that's better.
So I have had RA for about 38 years, I think. So obviously I have significant joint damage because of RA, because it was long before biologics came in. That then would mean that even with great treatment, I would still have some difficulties. The thing that concerns me is that we have to be sure that remission is a really strict criteria. For example, I might think, oh, if I ever get a medication where I feel great, which has never happened yet, then I could say, oh, I feel so much better. I've still got this problem and that problem, but I'm so much better. Is that remission? Well, it wouldn't be remission, but it would be a great improvement on quality of life. To me, remission would be somebody who does not have any symptoms that affect their independence, their quality of life, their sleep. They're no longer fatigued very easily. That would be remission. Because this is research is all about using it in clinical trials. Obviously, the majority of the clinical trials will be drug-related clinical trials, so we can't say it's remission without drugs. But another concern I would have, because it's in a clinical trial, would we be saying that achieve remission at a time point or over a long time point? So, for example, the drug company might say, well, this person achieved that remission on that day, so they are in remission. Whereas in fact, that might have just been a really good day. So that might have been stuff that you have already looked at in the research so far. The other thing about being really strict criteria is that it does filter in over time to clinical practice. And again, my concern would be that employers might say, but you're in remission, you don't need to have flexible working hours. Or you're in remission, so therefore we don't need to pay you benefits anymore. Those kind of things. So we have to look at the big picture for patients. But anyway, and also, why do we need to look at remission? Some of the comments are, we may never achieve remission. Well, if we don't achieve remission, we don't achieve remission. Look at the drugs, as you're trying to say, to make sure we achieve remission. But if I'd rather fewer people achieved remission than many people achieved the same level but were counted as in remission, if that makes any sense. So I'll give you one example. One of the drugs I was on brought my CRP down to 1, which it's never been in my RA life. And yet I had quite high disease activity, but my CRP was 1. And I remember when my rheumatologist told me my CRP was 1, I just thumped the desk and said, it's a scam, because it just didn't seem to be possible. Anyway, that's me. Some of it that makes sense.
Well, I mean, there's so much there, Pam, that I wouldn't even try to address all the issues. I'm going to try one, and I'll let some other people speak to the other. Just to the issue of duration of remission. In the original definition and the committee, we purposefully decided not to put duration in, because there was absolutely no agreement on what a minimum relevant duration of remission would be. So we said, let's get this definition fixed, and then some other people can start thinking about minimum duration. And obviously remission of a day would not make much sense. But you could have a trial where you're just going to measure and say, okay, let's see what the distribution of remission duration is in a trial, and see, how long it takes. Actually, long ago, I tried to do some analysis on that front. It's quite difficult, but we need to get experience with how long remissions can last. And remissions can be off drug, because the definition doesn't include anything about drugs. You can have an on-drug remission, off-drug remission of 3 months, 6 months, 1 year. So the definition is actually quite flexible. And we need research to say, okay, what's minimum relevant? And then we need a good ruler again, which I've just told you is so difficult to find. Anyway, that would be my answer to that one issue.
I suppose also worth pointing out from the qualitative work, there was no agreement across patients over how long remission should last to be classed as remission, or whether remission meant being drug-free, or whether you could be in remission on medication. And so lots of those contextual issues around what remission is was disputed across patients.
But colleagues, it's a very important point, because in some countries, for example, in Russia, where do I work? Sometimes we have very intensive care, for example, for rheumatoid arthritis in some regions. We use, for example, pulse therapy, steroids pulse therapy, and after that we have improvement in patients, and some patients show decrease of whole activity parameters. So, for example, tender, so they achieve Boolean remission criteria, but they worse. You know, it's not a good idea to use such a treatment, and they worse in for example, 1 month, usually one or 2 months they are at their initial position, and it's not a remission. Everyone understands that it's short-time improvement. So maybe some we know that remission criteria less than 6 months, it shouldn't be remission, it's only improvement. It's a low disease activity, but we are not sure that it's a real decrease of the activity. And why it's important, another point I wanted to discuss with you, we understand that intensive we always use those tools that we use in trials in our real life. A lot of people do that. And I'm not sure that remission and this high word of remission will not be used for the reduction of the treatment. And this point is very important, because when the physician in real world looks at and discuss with his patient that the patient has the remission, there are two variants. The physician wants to sometimes to perform the reduction of the treatment, and the patient wants, she says, oh, I'm in remission, especially in early RI. We have such a phenomenon when patient has a low duration of the disease, and they decrease the treatment, and we know that in a lot of times there is a relapse. So maybe as idea, we have to use not term of remission, but we have term clinical drug dependent remission or clinical laboratory remission, because we understand that ultrasound remission, MRI remission, and other types of remissions couldn't be achieved in the majority of patients until the recent times, until the cures nowadays.
Thank you.
So thank you. What do you think about this idea? So this.
Nobody going to come back on that?
I'm waiting for you, Caroline.
Oh, you're waiting for me? Okay, sorry. Yes, I think that they're really good points. I suppose I'd be interested in what the patients think about those points of whether we can have different types of remission on medicated remission, non-medicated remission.
I think 100% necessary. I think that you need to start with those starting points, those baselines, and because we all are so unique, and also to piggyback on what Martin said too, even if you can put in the treatment versus others, it's just that baseline that's where we really have to start with the uniqueness and the atypical and the diversity, especially as we were moving really into the world of precision medicine. We just got to remember, that the baseline needs to be diverse.
Maybe we have to speak about duration in view of not less than 3 months, not less than 6 months. So we have to discuss in this point of view, for not some one day or 2 days, but not less than. I think it will be very practical, and agreement could be achieved in this point, especially if we will use some data from damage trials, from MRI ultrasound damage, and compare clinical outcomes with ultrasound or from MRI outcomes. And in some time point, I agree with Martin that we physicians understand the remission as predictive value of good response, damage response, and stopping of progression of erosions and other joint damage. And if we will discuss in a patient's point of view, of course, it's decrease of clinical features of array. It's understandable, and it could be so. So maybe we have to discuss that remission has to be like predictive value, but in patient's time of view, but the time of remission duration is a very important point because another case we have to understand under remission every improvement, every short time improvement, and maybe and this time short improvement is not prediction of nice outcomes, long-term outcomes. We understand.
Okay. I think in the interest of time, we should try to now, if we have new points to raise them briefly, because we won't be able to discuss them out. I see the chat is very active, so we're getting lots of good ideas there too. But if you want to raise a point, try to make it brief, and then we can have some brief answers, and so the discussion becomes more perky, if you want.
Hi, it's Kathy Hofstetter talking. One of the points that I think is maybe the elephant in the room for a lot of patients is the issue about remission durability and length of remission in terms of insurance companies, because I know here in Canada, insurance companies are appointing case managers to look after these things. And if somebody gets wind of the fact that you are on a disability pension and you are classified as being in remission, you're going to get pushed to go back to work, regardless of how long that remission lasts. They're not going to look at that. These people are not qualified to look at all these subtle nuances and things like this. And I think that's one of the main things that patients really, really worry about is loss of benefits.
Yeah, and I thought that was one of the points Pam raised as well. I think that's, yeah, it is an important point. I suppose just to bring us back on track a little bit, OMERACT is focusing on outcome measures for trials, and we've got about 20 minutes left, so it would be good to try and build us towards the questions that we're hoping to get some voting on towards the end. Gert, I think.
I would like to point out that I feel that I'm in remission right now. I have been having RA for 38 years, like Pam. And when I read all the materials and looked at the films in advance, I sort of understood that independence meant that you were able to open a box or do practical things. I cannot open a box, even though I am in remission right at the moment. But I'm sort of thinking, what is the definition of independence? I would love to be able to say that independence also had something to do with how I felt and how I was coping. And I think something came up in the chat regarding that, because I was asking someone about it. But anyway, I think it's important to actually define independence, because then I guess also you get little sub-elements that you might want to interpret or whatever, to put in.
So for the study, we used the input we had from the qualitative work to ask the question in our instrument: over the last week, have you been able to do things as and when you want without needing any kind of assistance? That was the question people were asked to rate on a scale of 0 to 10, 0 being best and 10 worst, in terms of the ability to do things as and when you want. So that was one question, which obviously is very simple. So I think work that could be taken forward is to do exactly what you say and flesh that out a little bit more and try to see whether there are elements of independence that are more important than others in different stages of the disease, etc., etc. I think that would be a very good suggestion.
Martin,
but this is the question we used.
Martin, can I clarify that you restricted it to not being able to use assistive devices or assistance of another person?
It did not specify anything. It just said without needing any kind of assistance. So implicitly that would be help from another person, I would say. But I mean, these questions are never perfect, as you know.
And some of those issues around the measure of independence is perhaps worth thinking about whether I think one of our questions we'll be asking later is whether the independence measure whether that's worth further exploration of, so whether as a domain you think there's enough evidence there, and we certainly don't necessarily think we've got the right way of measuring it yet.
It would be to have a copy of that particular independence tool, so that we know the questions that are on that if we're going to look at it again.
This is Nicola Delbeth from New Zealand. I just have a question around, I've been really struck by the patient comments on the chat and this concept of not wanting to define remission without I guess an autonomous voice. And I guess I'd be interested to hear from the group around whether they thought about actually having a direct question around, do you, is your arthritis as good as gone at the moment? And, clearly we don't want to like relitigate the whole thing and start again, but what was the thinking around not building in a question like that specifically to ask patients whether they are in remission?
It was in there. Actually, it was one of the criteria.
Okay. So, but that wasn't used as a cut point. And so how did that perform compared with the hack?
No. So we did lots of analyses. So we have to distinguish between the analysis. But in one of these, in the analysis to see, which instrument works best, we put in pain, fatigue, independence separately and together. But we also put in the answer to the question, do you think your disease is as good as gone? And see whether the answer to that question would work better in predicting hack remission.
Okay, sorry, I didn't see that in your slides when you presented the various forward regression analyses.
Okay,
it may have been there, but I didn't see that.
You want me to show it again?
Well, you could summarize it, that's fine.
Well, like I said, I have to go there. Okay, so let me just show this one slide, see whether it works. So can you see that?
Yeah.
So this is the result of the backward logistic regression to predict hack remission. We had Boolean to start with, and then the individual elements. But we also had an analysis where we started with Boolean and then added that single question in to see how well it would predict, and it predicted.
Okay, so what's the thinking of not using that rather than the various scales, as in, like pain, fatigue, independence, numerical rating scales? What's the, can you explain why you wouldn't use that, why you wouldn't, consider using that instead?
No, we've considered everything, and on the basis of the analysis so far, we can't choose. And we haven't got a clear winner to say, okay, let's go this way. So we say, for now, our data is insufficient to go back to the learned societies and say, look, this is what you have to do. Look at these data. We're not saying that it shouldn't be changed. All we're saying is, for now, we can't have a very strong argument to say, this is what you need to do.
Okay, thank you for clarifying.
So we've really focused, I think, on the existing tools for remission, with the concept being that a single tool in a trial to define remission is the premise upon which we've been moving forward. There has been discussion about whether there's a separate measures for patient-defined remission, for example, based on the question just posed, and separate measures for independence. But we've considered that to be outside the remit of this group. That's not to say that that's not a valid approach going forward, and future iterations of this group or another may certainly wish to do that. We were planning today to try to come to some kind of consensus of over the data that have been presented in terms of whether we should be changing the existing ACR-EULAR remission criteria or recommending change based on the analyses presented to date. And obviously there have been some significant limitations about the body of work required to actually answer that question. And we think this is probably as good as we're going to get for quite some time, unless alongside this exercise we have other groups who can look at these data in more detail, and there's hopefully good prospects of that. But we're really trying to get some kind of consensus from the group about whether we can recommend at the moment that the ACR-EULAR criteria for remission can actually be changed. And a sort of a secondary point to that is if that's not the case, one of the things we haven't, and we'll be posing that question shortly, but if that's not the case, the other question that's been raised, and actually we haven't focused on that very much in the discussion today, is whether the cut point for the patient global assessment could be changed. And again, we don't have the data to support that, but that would be another approach. So there've been lots of fantastic suggestions in the chat about how patient global assessment is derived in terms of changing anchors, but also changing the cut point might be another way of trying to incorporate all of these complex elements of remission within the existing tools rather than developing separate patient-based tools. So we'll be coming on to the polling. I just want to check, Susanna, given that our breakout groups have...
Can I just, because there's also a question in the chat on what is the cut point. Two things to say about that cut point. I haven't presented any data. There is some data in this analysis about the cut point that can be very briefly summarized to say that patients who answered yes to that patient perceived remission question had a mean patient global of 2. So higher than 1 in the mean, which is at least one suggestion to say that cut point could be relaxed. And what is a cut point? Well, in the remission criteria, you have to meet four things. One, you cannot have more than one tender joint. You cannot have more than one swollen joint. Your CRP has to be 1 or less on a scale of 1 to 10. And your patient global has to be 1 or less on a scale from 0 to 10. So those are the criteria. And if we were to move the patient global criterion to 2, obviously more people would be able to meet that criterion and the number of people in remission would increase. I think that's, Susanna, what you're alluding to. And we haven't discussed it, so I think we should also delete the question we were asking because it's not in the presentation, so it's no information that we can decide anything on.
Sure, all right. I just want to check if you might be able to answer, given that the breakout function's not working, do we have polling?
Yes, Sean has just messaged we do have polling.
Oh, great, good, okay. So we're moving into the last 10 minutes of our session. I think because we won't be doing a little summary of the session in terms of report back, we've gained another 10 minutes for discussions, and we'll be summarising all of the notes from the chat and that have been taken by our rapporteurs today. But is there any more pressing questions or comments before we turn to the polling? In that case...
Sorry, just before I go to the polling, just to clarify, you want me to pull question 3 out about the patient global cutoff?
Yes,
Yeah,
please.
patient global
Okay.
cutoff out.
Okay.
Yes, thank you.
Just give me 1 second.
While Shauna's doing that, could I just ask the rapporteurs to stay after the session for maybe 10 minutes or so, just to check we've got your notes. Thank you.
Okay. So we're going to be doing the voting or the polling using the Zoom polling function, so you don't need to use the app that's been used in other groups in the past. So here come the 3 questions. So the first question is, do you agree that decisions on the current remission criteria, that should say, need to be taken now? In other words, we have to change the current criteria now, yes or no?
It's more just we need to decide if it's being changed now, not that we need to change it now.
Yeah, do we need to make a decision now?
I didn't get a voting thing. Where do I vote?
Sometimes when you're on an iPad, there should be something at the top that says polling. It's not as clear on an iPad. I've heard people say that before.
And Shauna, is it correct that the submit button is not active yet?
I'm seeing people answer.
I think you have to complete all 4 before you.
Oh, there's a. Oh, you have to scroll down. There's 4.
Working.
Sorry. Yep. Gotcha.
So we just have yes, no, we don't have it. Not sure. Is that okay?
You are always sure, Pam.
Sorry about that.
So do you agree, the second question is, do you agree that there is insufficient evidence from the data to change the ACR-EULAR remission criteria at this time? The third question is, do you agree that independence is an important domain? And the fourth question is, do you agree that the current numerical rating scale for independence should be further validated? So yes, you have to complete each question and then click submit. And we're just giving it a couple more minutes. Sean, are they coming in now ready to present the results?
Yeah, you're at 38 of 42. Bev and I can't vote because we're the co-hosts, so you're pretty close. I'm going to end it and share.
Thank you. All right, so the summary is, do you agree that decisions on the current criteria need to be taken now? 74% said no. So this is still a work in progress. We haven't made any definite decisions. Do you agree that there is insufficient evidence from the data to change the ACR-EULAR remission criteria at this time? 92% said yes. Do you agree that independence is an important domain? 92% said yes. And do you agree that the current NRS scale for independence should be further validated? 90% said yes. So at this point, thank you very much to everybody for voting. I think that's reasonably clear. We still have some uncertainties about whether we should take the decision now, but more than 70% say perhaps we're not in a position to do that yet. Particularly based on insufficient data so far to change the existing remission criteria. There's definitely the need for more work on independence, and that may involve the existing NRS. So at this point, the existing chairs of this SIG feel that the remit of the group has been completed in terms of looking at the patient perspective of remission using the existing definitions that were used for the analysis. And at the moment, there are no plans to go ahead and change or recommend change to the ACR-EULAR remission criteria. The SIG in its current format, therefore, will not continue at future OMERACTs, but that doesn't mean that the concepts that have been raised and discussed in detail today, and some of the excellent suggestions for taking this work forward don't represent a terrific opportunity to look at the concept of the patient perspective on remission in rheumatoid arthritis to be examined in further detail. I think to some degree the analyses have raised more questions than they've actually answered, and that we're starting to get some sense about what remission means for patients, but that in order to really incorporate that into a single measure of remission is going to be very complicated and very complex, and that we probably are going to need to collect a considerable amount of longitudinal data, probably with radiographic outcomes as well, to really understand what that means. We've gained today quite a lot of insight into what independence looks like for patients, and raised some really critical contextual issues about the starting points for individuals, those who already have damage versus those who don't. I guess one of the interesting things about all of this discussion is that this is not a unique phenomenon to rheumatoid arthritis, that many of the other inflammatory conditions, whether they be joint destruction, giving rise to joint destruction, or other forms of damage, as well as reversible inflammatory features, this sort of discussion will be critical in those contexts as well. So I'd like to thank everybody for joining the group and making such a great contribution to the discussion. One of our aims is obviously to prepare a manuscript on the basis of the work. There'll be two separate manuscripts really. There'll be obviously the data presented separately, and then the summary of this group and this meeting today. Those of you who would like to be authors on that are very welcome to do so. It will involve obviously including the comments that have been made today, or a summary of those comments, but also the document would be circulated, and we'd be interested in your contributions in help shaping that manuscript for authorship. And I'd also like to thank Shauna and Bev for their assistance with the SIG and for today's meeting. My co-chairs, Caroline and Martin, and Catherine Hill, who was previously a co-chair, as well as all the members of the SIG, both clinical and patient research partners. So on that note,
just before we break the session, Lynn was asking if I could poll just one more question. Would you mind if I launch that quickly?
Sure.
I'll be quick.
We get to agree.
So you should see, should see it's separate. It's a question on its own, and it just asks, should we continue the work to gather more data on patient global? Yes or no?
So I'm assuming everyone's agreeable to voting on this question. Please vote. We'll have 1 minute left to get the results.
Thank you.
Again, there is support for that suggestion. Thank you very much, Lynn. Further work to be taken forward. So on that note, thank you very much, everybody, for your contributions. And we definitely look forward to seeing you all face to face, hopefully in 2022.